People who watch security cameras for a living, what creepy things have you tried to forget? Years ago I worked overnight at a homeless shelter for men. A good portion of the regular guys that stayed there had mental health and/or drug problems. There were a lot of fights and the occasional stabbing, but for the most part everyone was relatively behaved and most were good people at heart. I received a lot of threats, but one ever acted on them. One night when I arrived for my shift I noticed there was a much larger police presence than usual. I walked into our office and the officer in charge started asking me if I had noticed a guy, Richard, behaving unusually at all lately. I had not saw anything out of the ordinary and I told them such. I looked at the dorm list and noted that he was marked as no longer staying at the shelter. He was a long-term resident, so I thought this was odd. The police left without telling me anything except the fact they needed security footage from 2 specific cameras from the night before. I did not work the night before and the guy I normally work with pulled a no-show. We were the only 2 people besides the manager, who was on a holiday, that were trained on how to burn footage to a DVD. I spent the rest of my shift in shock. When I found the footage they were looking for I felt physically ill. Richard had gone out onto the second floor smoking deck, finished a cigarette, got up on the railing, and dove head first onto the cement below. The first camera on the second floor showed him jump, but the second camera on the first floor was much more gruesome. He landed head first and rolled over in a way that he was staring right into the camera as he lay there dying. I quickly put the footage on DVD and went to throw up. I was given the next day off. No counseling. No nothing. I will never forget that one. He was a pretty good dude as far as I knew him. Some mental issues, but no one knew he was suicidal or why he did it. So many of these will give me nightmares, so I'll throw one in the mix that I never want to forget. A year back I was working at a hostel and we have security cameras throughout the building. Watching the footage from the camera in the kitchen. It is about 2 a.m. and a very drunk guest walks in, grabs some snacks, and accidentally drops an empty bottle on the ground. He then proceeds to kick it up into the air, then kick it again in air, where it flies across the entire length of the room perfectly into the recycling bin. In his drunken state he threw up his hands, ran around in a circle clearly in shock at how amazing he is. Then after looking around he noticed there was no one there to see it. After that he looked visibly depressed and stumbled back out of the kitchen. Kid pooped in an aisle of Walmart and an old lady slipped in it. Working in a rehearsal studio for bands we had camera at the front desk that pointed down the hall with the entrances to all the rooms. One day I'm sitting there minding my own business and noticed there was a girl sitting in the hallway outside one of the studios. She had come in with the band that was practicing and I just assumed she didn't feel like sitting in the loud space with the band. So I got up and went to tell her she was welcome to sit in the lobby where there was a couch and TV. I got around the corner and she wasn't there. I went back the desk and there she was, sitting in the hall waiting outside the room. So I went back out to find her not there again. I assumed she had gone into the room, so I went and knocked and they informed me that the girl had left a while before, just after they had gotten started practicing. So I went back and there she was, still on the camera. It was only then that I realized I had accidentally bumped the freeze frame button for the monitor. I used to do asset protection for a Walmart in a very heroin addicted area. The creepiest thing was seeing how fast someone would go from completely normal to absolutely out of it in the span of a year because of the drug. You could build a timeline of their demise through CCTV pictures and video. One man in particular really stood out to me. The first time I apprehended him he was very polite and intelligent, just stealing to get his fix. A year later and the 4th time I caught him he was basically a shell of a man. He tried running from me and I looked him right in the eyes and said, "I know you. Gary last name. Please don't run." The look on his face of someone knowing him who he couldn't even remember will always stay with me. Not necessarily creepy, but I work on security for a popular UK supermarket and came into work one day to find a note asking me to burn an incident off the cameras onto disk. It was something from the car park previous night. So I figured we'd had a shoplifter in or an accident in the car park. But no, it wasn't anything as pleasant as that. We'd had a situation where a couple, older white gentleman and youngish Asian female, had been in store and the night security guy just thought they were acting a bit funny. So he follows them round store on CCTV in store to see if anything went on. Nothing really happens during this time, though the guy seems to become more and more aggravated. They go outside having purchased their shopping to pack it into the car boot. When a clear argument occurs between them, he suddenly turns round, kicks the empty trolley across the car park and then smacks her full force in the face out of seemingly nowhere. She recoils in pain. A bit more shouting takes place but she seems to dutifully take her seat in the passenger seat despite what just took place. During the process of burning this to disk for the police, since our security guy had called it in as an assault, I had to rewatch the moment where he hits her over and over again. But watch helplessly as she seems to calmly get into the car of the man who just assaulted her. Long story short, she was a mail order bride who was trafficked here and as well as assault he got done for people trafficking. So a pretty wholesome ending to an otherwise awful story. When I worked as a security officer, it was my first week on the job. I watched my boss and another officer try to talk a guy off of the top of our parking structure. Didn't work. Watched him jump off and land next to an employee who was coming in for her shift. Guy hit the ground so hard it exploded the belt right off of his pants. I will never forget watching that. I'm not in security, but I work for a bank and part of my job is checking the cameras in the morning for pings overnight, and then making sure all the pings were just squirrels or leaves, etc. Last week I saw a ping on our back entrance camera, and when I went to watch the video, it was a guy I didn't recognize walking back and forth in front of the door at 3 a.m. for a solid 20 minutes, like just pacing the whole time. And every couple minutes he'd stop and walk up to the door and stare into the camera. Then he'd go back to pacing. A car eventually went by and that must have set something in him off because he legit ran away and didn't come back. We ended up calling the cops about it, but I still have no idea who he was or what his deal was. One time there was a spider on the lens. It was big. It stayed there for like 3 days. Was watching CCTV footage of a parking deck, and on the 9th level there's this guy sitting in the middle of the deck, banging his head on one of the pillars. All of a sudden the guy just stops, and runs to the edge. Without stopping or jumping, he flings himself over the edge. I immediately called dispatch and told them what had happened. Few days later I was offered counseling for those events. Mostly lots of sex. I've had to turn on the microphone and tell them to stop it or they'll be thrown out of the college gym. I work in a retail store, and for a while I worked security here. Watching the security cameras wasn't technically my job, but we were consistently short-handed in that department and the manager was grooming me for promotion. So I got to fill in and watch the cameras occasionally. One day when we were reviewing footage from overnights, we saw this teenager calmly set down his shopping basket, take off his hat and glasses, and just charge at a wall, hit it head on. He did this 2 more times. When he was done, his face was a bloody mess, and he put his hat and glasses back on and just left. Weirded me right the hell out. I used to do IT support for a company that had a lot of heavy machinery moving around inside a big warehouse type area. This giant front-end loader would scoop up material and dump it into a hopper. Along the sides of the floor were these huge concrete barriers. I've heard them called Jersey barriers and mafia blocks, but they are about 10 feet tall, and this one guy's life was ended when the front-end loader inadvertently scooped the base of the barrier and landed on one of 2 guys walking shoulder to shoulder through the plant. I was tasked to review the footage, then make copies, 6 of them, to be exact, and then ensure that the footage worked and was self-executable and able to be run from a USB stick. So I had to watch the footage of this guy get killed over a dozen times. I, too, was offered counseling for just watching the video. I used to work IT at a university, and last Easter we had a break-in. We found the footage of the guy going in at 2 p.m., leaving at around 3, and not really taking anything. Fast forward to 7 p.m. and the guy comes back in and is walking around the auditorium till 6 a.m. the next morning. In that time he proceeded to strip into his underwear, steal and wear a mask the Japanese exchange students made for the teacher, and smoke a shit ton. He managed to steal 6 full bags of random items. We've dubbed him as the Jack-Off Bandit. I used to work loss prevention for a big box store. We had a lady get arrested for public indecency and I was asked to investigate. I had to follow her backwards from the point of arrest and it was a trip to say the least. She arrived at the store swerving and nearly hitting several cars. She entered the store with 2 young children, both of whom are mentally handicapped. That lady literally dragged those kids around the store, slapping them and tugging at their ears/collars if they didn't obey. At some point she just abandons them in the clothing section, walks through the back doors, to the break area, and I'm assuming she thought it was the bathroom because she proceeds to pull down her pants and shits all over the fire exit door. She pulls her pants up, without wiping mind you, and goes back to the floor like nothing happened. Someone saw what she did and followed her. Luckily there's an officer in the store at the time and quickly approaches her when the associate tells him what she did. Needless to say, she was definitely high and or drunk and was arrested. The scary part is, she did not mention those kids not one time. It wasn't until I reviewed the tape that I saw they were just still waiting by the shopping cart completely oblivious and afraid to move. Child services was later called and I still think about those kids often. Breaks my heart to think about the bullshit those kids must still be going through. Wasn't a security officer, but I worked at a 24/7 gas station for a while. One night my coworker accidentally killed himself while at work, and I made the mistake of watching the footage. He went to the back of the store with a bag of drugs, probably cocaine, snorted it and started acting funny for about 10 minutes. He then sits in the back office and gets fidgety/thrashing around until finally he just goes limp in the chair. He had died of a heart attack and sat there for 5 hours before anybody came in. Thought the absence of an employee was strange, and called the cops. It was really weird seeing people come in and act all pissy for the lack of service. They'd just leave thinking someone was lazy. But nah, dude was dead. Not a CCTV operator, but I was chummy with the security guards I used to work with. It was in a large 3-story retail building in a city center and we had all sorts of folks coming in and out. We had a phantom wanker and phantom shitter who would leave their bodily fluids in random places. They were known as Jack the Shitter and Wanksy, and it turned out to be the same guy. He was clever and knew where all the security camera were. He'd cased the joint. The only reason he got busted was because they were moved. By far the funniest thing I saw was a guy being chased into the building on the second floor by the police. He ran around the shop for about 5 minutes while being chased by police and our security guards. It was great watching it on different screens as he moved through the building. Anyway, he got to ground floor and underestimated the drop onto the escalator and broke his leg, and the escalator him brought back up to the feet of the security guards who were chasing him. It was brilliant. I used to do IT support for a charity that supplied housing and support for homeless people. A large proportion also had mental health issues. So there were a fair amount of interesting events that happened. Being in IT, I avoided experiencing most of it firsthand, though I was threatened with being stabbed on about my 3rd day. Anyway, I come in one Monday, and there's an email labeled urgent, saying there was an incident at the stairwell of one of the properties on Sunday night, and could I pull the relevant CCTV footage and put it on a DVD. I had to do this fairly frequently. I skip through the footage, find the incident, usually a fight or blatant drug dealing, and burn it to DVD for the police. The email never mentioned what the incident was, so I skip through the footage, and watch as a clearly very agitated man ties a rope around a stair rail at the top of the stairs, then at his neck, looks over the rail and then just casually tips forward over it. The rope flipped him round, and he dangled there twitching for far too long, before he just stopped. So yeah, that was a fun Monday. I had a job reviewing hidden tape footage looking for people sabotaging food product in a factory. The entire idea was creepy on one level. They made pasta. They were finding things like glass, screws, staples and shit in the product. Thankfully none of it made it out of the plant. They had metal detectors at the end of the line, because it's common for things like metal shavings to get in the product given the machines. So they want to catch that and stop the product. But machines went off and they'd inspect the product to find ridiculous shit that there is no way could have made it in unless someone put it there. That's creepy because think about how possible terrible it would have been had that product ever made it to the public. You aren't paying attention. You throw your shells in the pot, boil them along with a nail, then feed that shit to your kids who just chomped down? Thank God for the fail-safes. Anyways, they need to catch whoever is doing it. They install the cameras in the areas where most of the affected product is made and packaged. They record it all. Then they hire me to go through the tapes on high speed, looking for alarms going off on the machines or anything weird. So I see a ton of stuff that's notable. Some of it funny, some of it cruel, some of it just plain terrible. Eventually I do figure out who the saboteur was. But the creepiest thing was this guy driving a forklift around with his kid not only on the forklift with him, but hanging out of the sides of it waving at people. It's creepy cause at some point not long after that, the guy killed his kid somehow in a forklift accident. Thank fuck the accident wasn't on tape, or at least my tapes. Kid never should have been allowed even in the plant. Certainly not on the fucking forklift. And this guy killed his kid. So it was like I was watching a ghost. And I kept wishing I'd had those tapes to review a week or whatever earlier. Cause as soon as I would have said something they would have disciplined the dude. And maybe saved the kid. I reviewed the security cameras around my office building. The cameras only monitor the outside of the building. We have signs posted everywhere stating cameras are watching. You get accustomed to certain movement patterns and activation of cameras. So I don't have to review the whole day's activity, just the parts that show things out of the ordinary. For a while, homeless people were using it are behind landscaping to kick back and smoke drugs, marijuana, heroin off foil, glass meth pipes, you name it. It's all in full view of one of the cameras. Watched a few drug sales there too. However, the most disturbing by far was the sex. Basically, guys would take the homeless women to that area and do any number of weird and wonderful things. The weirdest of all was when some dude lay on the ground and a drug-slinging / homeless woman sat on a bench looking at her phone. He slipped off her flip-flop and started sucking off her toes. He took short breaks intermittently to hit a glass meth pipe, then went back to work on the toes. This went on for about 45 minutes. Then they left. We systematically found almost all the homeless porn stars during the day and told them our place has cameras and not to come back. Things have been quiet for a few years now. We have an old fountain at my apartment building that has a large eagle statue. One night I had to check the security cameras because of a break-in, and at 2 a.m. I came across footage of about 5 guys taking turns humping the eagle. One of them even stole the Santa hat I had on it. Not for a living, but we had security cameras installed on the property whilst we were living in South Africa. We had a monitor set up next to the bed so we could see what was happening on the 4 cameras without having to get up out of bed. One night we heard something, so we turn on the monitor and see nothing unusual. I'm ready to go back to sleep, but my partner thinks something is off about one of the cameras. Does this camera look like it's pointing in a different direction slightly, she asks. No. Same as always, and it's back to bed for me. She isn't convinced, so she starts watching the recordings. True enough, footage of some dude prowling around on the property and the camera catches him adjusting it. The terrifying bit? The way his face looked beneath the balaclava. Murder mask is what my so called it. Pretty creepy shit. Whenever we have a bad crash or anything serious happen, we usually search for cameras that captured the incident. Can't tell you how many times I've watched people die on video. Not really creepy, but just not fun to do. My friend used to run security for a parking garage and he saw everything from drug deals to what he could only assume was prostitution going on, but the one thing he will never forget was the guy that got stabbed. He was walking down the parking garage looking drunk, which is why he was looking at him. From his explanation, he stops and starts yelling and flinging his arms around, and just outside of that camera's range was another guy in a hoodie and basketball shorts with the same type of body language. He runs to grab the only other person on staff to see if he should call security or the cops. When he gets back after what he says was 4 or 5 minutes, they are now in each other's face, and as the other guy calls security, he sees the hoodie guy stab the other dude in the stomach/abdomen multiple times before making a run for it. The next 5 minutes were traumatizing to just hear. Apparently the guy that got stabbed got up and was crawling towards the stairs and was just leaving this giant trail of blood behind him. If anyone has worked in this before, can you answer me one question? As someone watching the footage, are you allowed to leave your post and intervene? My friend said no, but how could one just sit there and not do anything? The guy that got stabbed died, and they were never told about whether the other dude was caught. Spent a few years working front desk for various shifts at a few hotels, moved a lot during this time, so I got a pretty big sampling of people from here and there. But the one thing I will never forget was right here in my home state of KY. In broad daylight, a woman who did not have a room with us walked into the pool area from the large, sliding glass window, speaking on her cell phone with a bag hanging from that hand, and a toddler walking with her on the other hand. She let go of the toddler, then proceeded to get completely nude and continue her conversation standing in the pool area. Not the pool itself, just the pool area.